Today and yesterday, in just the last 2 days, 14 NATO troops have been killed in Afghanistan. 6 killed yesterday, 8 more killed today, in 5 separate attacks. While violence is ramping up in the war, efforts to end the war are taking some really dramatic turns. The New York Times and others reporting today that in addition to fighting the Taliban on the increasingly deadly battlefields of Afghanistan, U.S.-led forces there are also now, quote, permitting the movement of senior Taliban leaders to attend initial peace talks in Kabul. Think about that for a second. I mean, everybody has admitted for a while that the war will end in Afghanistan the way most wars end, through talking, through negotiation. General Petraeus, late last month, started prepping the U.S. public for this when he outlined the preconditions the Afghan government was setting for talks with the Taliban to start. General Petraeus said, quote, this is how you end these kinds of insurgencies. It's understandable enough in theory. These things end by talking. But in practice, it is harder to fathom. U.S. forces knowing who senior Taliban leaders are, knowing where they are, and knowingly letting them pass safely on their way to Kabul, and then presumably back home again to keep fighting U.S. troops. Joining us now is Brian Katulis. He's a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. He specializes in U.S. national security policy in the Middle East and in South Asia. Brian, thanks very much for being here tonight. I appreciate your time.
Hey, Rachel. How are you?
Good. It is tough to fathom U.S. troops letting Taliban leaders pass safely when so many U.S. troops are still being killed by the Taliban. I mean, the only reason it makes sense is if these negotiations are really going to end the war. Do you think it's likely that they really are?
Well, I don't think anybody really knows the answer to that question. And I would draw a parallel to Iraq. You know, we all know the violence is down in Iraq. A big part of it wasn't because we added more troops. I mean, that was one factor. But a big part of it was that we reached out to some of those insurgents that were attacking the Iraqi forces. And today, we actually have an Iraqi government and a parliament that's formed that actually has political movements that has American blood on their hands. So that's been a part of the nature of these conflicts, you know?
In terms of that parallel with Iraq, one of the interesting things, of course, about what happened in 2006 is that those insurgent groups on their own decided that they wanted to be a part of negotiating some sort of solution that excluded groups like, say, al-Qaeda in Iraq. Once those insurgent groups decided that on their own, U.S. forces decided to get in and try to facilitate it. Is that same sort of thing happening in Afghanistan, where this is happening organically among Afghans and that we are just trying to help, or are we making this happen?
I think it may be happening organically. The key factor here, the difference, is Pakistan. And the fact that in Pakistan, a lot of these militant groups have a safe haven. And we know this, you know, U.S. operations have gone across the border. There have been multiple drone strikes there. And some elements of the Pakistani security establishment have supported elements of the insurgency. So they're the key wild card that make it a little bit more complicated than Iraq, and we have to be careful about these parallels. I brought the comparison up, but this, you know, is very complicated. I would categorize these reconciliation talks and everything that Secretary Gates is talking about in Brussels right now as very important, but also easier said than done. Very hard to execute and actually get right.
Well, how involved are we in the talks? Do we know? I mean, are we counting on the Afghan government to be able to come to an enforceable deal, or are we actually involved in trying to make this happen and will be involved in trying to make it stick?
Well, I think the U.S. has been involved in multiple efforts for several years now, going back to as far back as 2002 to bring some elements of the Taliban back in. I think the only way it really works is if this is an Afghan-led process, if actually Karzai and others in the Afghan government can actually facilitate a power-sharing deal. If it's anyway seen to be something that we execute ourselves, it may not sustain itself. And at the end of the day, all of the parties have got to agree to it. I think the news reports in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times you're talking about allude to a NATO official saying that the U.S. has facilitated some travel. A lot of this has happened before, too, in places like Saudi Arabia and the UAE. There have been talks about talks for years, and I think we need to wait to see if there's more there in terms of whether there's a sustainable agreement here.
Brian, one of the things that I know that you have worked on and studied is the connection between the war effort and Americans' feelings about the war. Right. If this is the way the war ends, either in the short term, the medium term, or, God forbid, the long term, tell me how you see this playing out here. I mean, we sent U.S. troops to oust the Taliban. They stuck around and waged an insurgency against the new Afghan government. We installed 10 years later. That government makes a deal with the Taliban. How does that play out here among the American public?
Well, I think the key factor, number one, is does the American public perceive that we're safer as a result of all of these actions? We're in Afghanistan because of the 9/11 attacks. And I think if there's a sense that we've actually degraded al-Qaeda and others, I think if we pass that test, and I think we may have already passed that test when you hear statistics like 50 to 100 al-Qaeda representatives perhaps in Afghanistan. Then beyond that, I think there's this issue of most Americans today, sadly, I think are disconnected from these wars. I know you were out in Afghanistan earlier this summer. The burden of these wars are actually being borne mostly by the troops, other people serving in the U.S. government, and their families. That's a very narrow slice of the American public. And because we're financing this war and all of our wars on borrowed money, most Americans don't feel the financial impact of this. So the sad thing is that when you look at the midterm elections and the politics of national security, the vast majority of Americans aren't affected by what's going on right now. And this disconnection, I think, is one of the most dangerous things. So I think there'll be less attention to how this ends if it ends peacefully.
Which is bad in the sense of our moral obligation to be connected to this fighting and dying
Absolutely.
in our name, and it may be good in the sense of actually trying to wind down the war without it being politicized and extended for vainglory. Brian Katulis, Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress. Thanks very much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, Rachel.
Still ahead. Hey, look what Americans can do. Art plus infrastructure plus utility equals a very happy ending to the show tonight. Please stay with us for that.
The Rachel Maddow Show uses Cisco telepresence for face-to-face interviews.